members of the Academy for this honor, my dear friends who are here tonight.
The spectacle of their breakup had been designed, by one side at least, to function as a grand, diverting illusion. Brad Pitt, the eternal golden boy, was the master craftsman of this spectacle. He allowed the narrative of the struggling husband, the man who simply drank too much and was recovering, to be the only vulnerability he displayed. This calculated admission was a brilliant piece of emotional engineering. It humanized him without indicting him. The world could forgive a man who struggled with a bottle. The world, however, was far less willing to accept a man who allegedly choked a child and shoved his wife against a jet wall. This carefully managed confession of an alcohol problem acted as a bulletproof vest, deflecting the far more serious and terrifying claims of physical abuse. Every glossy magazine profile, every tearful, sober interview, every heartfelt acceptance speech for an Oscar became a reinforcement of the dominant, comforting lie. He was a good man who made a mistake, while Angelina Jolie was the cold, vengeful agent of his destruction. Her struggle, in stark contrast, was a descent into a punishing, bewildering isolation. She was fighting a system, legal, media, and cultural, that instinctively preferred his truth over hers. When she spoke of the plane incident, laying bare the specific, horrifying details of his alleged rage, she was not heard as a mother protecting her children, but categorized and dismissed as an actress playing the ultimate villainess. Her detailed court filings, filled with the raw, chaotic terror of that 2016 flight, were not treated as evidence of a pattern of violence, but as tactical ammunition in a bitter custody battle, a political maneuver rather than a desperate plea for safety. The very qualities that had made her a global icon, her intensity, her formidable intelligence, her unapologetic control over her own narrative, were now weaponized against her. She was painted as vindictive, controlling, and manipulative. The kind of woman who would stop at nothing, not even the destruction of her ex-husband's career, to win. This character assassination was effective because it aligned with a deep-seated cultural discomfort with powerful women who refused to suffer silently. The world was more comfortable seeing her as a shrew than seeing him as an abuser, and so, for years, the lie held. Pitt was untouchable. He moved through the world with an air of dignified resilience, a man who had faced his demons, the bottle, and emerged triumphant. Meanwhile, Jolie was left to nurse a wound that was not just personal, but existential. The trauma of having her deepest, most painful truth utterly rejected by the collective consciousness. It was a hellish solitude, a reality where she knew what had happened. Her children knew what had happened, and yet the outside world, armed with his beautiful smile and his lawyer's carefully crafted statements, deemed her the liar. Every red carpet she walked, every humanitarian trip she took, was filtered through the lens of the crazy ex-wife narrative. A public shaming that chipped away at her credibility and focused on the spectacle of the divorce rather than the substance of the claims. The biography of Gwyneth Paltrow was not merely a new detail. It was a devastating cultural earthquake. It was the moment that the past, like a forgotten key, slid perfectly into the lock of the present, threatening to blow open the entire fortress of Pitt's carefully guarded image. Paltrow's experience, decades earlier, was not the flashbang trauma of the private jet, but a slower, more insidious poison, the report of emotional difficulty, the need to visit friends simply to cry about a relationship that felt diminishing, belittling, and actively threatened by her own success. This was the quiet precursor, the blueprint for the larger, later disaster. Her recollection introduced a horrifying consistency. The alleged abuse wasn't a sudden break or a drunken aberration, but the evolving manifestation of a profound, narcissistic need for control and domination. If Pitt was allegedly emotionally abusive in his 20s, a partner whose ego allegedly required his fiancée to shrink her own light, then the question became, what happens when that deep-seated need for control meets the power of global stardom? The complexity of 6 children and the numbing relief of alcohol? Jolie's allegations suggested the answer. The emotional violence had found a physical outlet, the same toxic fragility that allegedly led him to belittle Paltrow's success had, years later, metastasized into the alleged rage that choked a child and shook a wife. The new biography didn't provide new court evidence, it provided a pattern. And in matters of human behavior and abuse, the pattern is often the most damning evidence of all. The Paltrow revelation forced a painful, necessary cultural reckoning. It echoed the broader, global shift where the collective disbelief in women's pain was finally starting to crumble. Jolie had been dismissed as an anomaly, a one-off, bitter ex. But Paltrow's testimony transformed her into a link in a chain. It suggested that Jolie's courage was not a reckless act of vengeance, but the necessary conclusion to a pattern of behavior that had been quietly suppressed for years. The golden image of Brad Pitt now faced a double exposure. The charming icon overlaid with the shadowy silhouette of the alleged manipulator and abuser. The verdict of the court was still pending, still tangled in the complexities of legal maneuvers, but in the court of public opinion, armed with the undeniable, consistent narrative of two different, courageous women, the narrative that Angelina Jolie had been right all along was beginning to settle, heavy and irreversible, into the stone of history. The myth was dying, and the truth, harsh and painful, was finally beginning to emerge from the darkness. The silence surrounding the truth of Brad Pitt was a calculated, colossal sound, carefully orchestrated and powerfully enforced by decades of image-making and public adoration. But now, that silence was being violently fractured, not by a legal judgment or a media expo, but by the quiet, unsettling echo of a past confession, a whisper from the 1990s that suddenly gave terrifying weight to the harrowing allegations of the present. Gwyneth Paltrow, once the golden girl of Hollywood, had ended her engagement to Pitt not with a dramatic fight or a blazing feud, but with a public explanation that was, in its time, perfectly acceptable. She simply wasn't ready for marriage. It was clean. It was simple. It and allowed both stars to move on, their mythologies intact. The truth she had shared with her closest friends, the true, agonizing reason she had walked away, was far more complex and insidious, describing a profound sense of emotional unsafety. It was not the kind of danger that leaves bruises and broken bones, not yet, but the silent, suffocating terror of being emotionally controlled, constantly belittled, and fundamentally diminished by the very man who was supposed to be her champion. This private, decades-old confession was the first vital piece of the puzzle, a slow-motion revelation that instantly transformed the entire narrative landscape. When two women, separated by decades, by status, by their respective silences and eventual outcry, began to describe versions of Brad Pitt that lined up in such profoundly uncomfortable, unsettling ways, the world could no longer, in good conscience, pretend it didn't hear. The combined weight of their testimonies created a gravitational pull that threatened to collapse the whole structure of his manufactured innocence. Gwyneth Paltrow, a woman renowned for her poise, her business acumen, and her general avoidance of public scandal or litigation, provided the historical context of deep emotional distress. Her quiet confidence to friends about a partner whose volatility brought her to tears was now placed directly beside Angelina Jolie's urgent, visceral descriptions of terror on that private jet Dales to specific, too harrowing to simply be ignored or dismissed as simple post-divorce vitriol. The result was a forced, inevitable reckoning. Jolie's story of physical and emotional violence no longer stood alone, vulnerable to easy dismissal. It now stood squarely beside another, and perhaps many others still unspoken, creating a consistent and chilling pattern of behavior. The similarities in their accounts were not merely coincidental. They were strikingly, terrifyingly precise. Both women described a Brad Pitt who seemed fundamentally threatened by their independence and self-possession. In the case of Gwyneth Paltrow, the alleged issue was her rising stardom and intellectual sophistication. Her success, her light, was reportedly perceived as a direct challenge to his ego, a light that needed to be dimmed, subtly or overtly, to maintain his own sense of dominance. In the later, more explosive marriage to Angelina Jolie, this control manifested in an alleged explosive reaction to her parenting decisions and her formidable, unyielding refusal to back down or surrender her own moral compass in family matters. Both women documented a consistent thread of volatility, emotional outbursts, and a crippling need to dominate. In the world of the 1990s engagement, this dark core manifested as the subtle humiliation and quiet tears that brought Paltrow to her friends' couches. In the chaotic, high-stakes environment of the 2016 flight, that same dark core exploded into alleged physical violence, culminating in the horrifying claims of choking and striking their children. The manifestation was different, escalating over 2 decades, but the root was exactly the same. Brad Pitt's fundamental, allegedly fragile need for control, his wounded ego, and his systemic inability to accept strong women standing fully in their own light. This narrative transcended the in their own light. This narrative
inconvenient truth. The breaking of this silence, spurred by the quiet echo of the past, was a victory not just for Jolie, but for every woman who has ever been disbelieved simply because her abuser was too beloved to fail. The stark, unsettling truth of why the world took so long to hear the agonizing claims of Angelina Jolie lies in a profound, Cultural failure of vision, the ingrained, pervasive tendency to excuse powerful men, a habit deeply embedded in the societal fabric. We have been expertly conditioned to reframe their cruelty as mere passion, their suffocating control as confident leadership, and their terrifying violence as a simple, regrettable symptom of stress or a private struggle with addiction. We are voracious consumers of the myth of the charming, handsome leading man. And when the slightest cracks appear in this flawless, lucrative facade, the collective impulse is not to inspect the damage, but to frantically patch them up, to repair the comfortable fantasy rather than face the profoundly uncomfortable, disruptive nature of the truth. This dynamic created an insurmountable wall around Brad Pitt, a wall that Angelina Jolie alone could not breach. She was the inconvenient messenger, the one whose truth required the world to sacrifice a beloved cultural icon, and the world, in its deepest resistance to disruption, chose to side with the idol. But when that same dark, unsettling truth is spoken again, from a different corner of history and from the mouth of another high-profile woman, Gwyneth Paltrow, carrying the same haunted edge of emotional pain, the collective denial becomes intellectually and morally unsustainable. The echo transforms the isolated complaint into a recognized pattern. For Angelina Jolie, this moment, this sudden external validation of her long, lonely struggle, is nothing short of a long-awaited, profound breath, a massive, necessary release of pressure. She has spent years fighting not out of spite, but from an almost primal, unyielding mother's desperation to protect her children and herself from a perceived danger. Her commitment to this truth was absolute. A fact powerfully illustrated by her reported refusal of a massive business deal, a career opportunity that carried the simple, sinister condition of her silence. She risked everything, millions of dollars, her highly managed reputation, and the very possibility of personal peace, simply for the right to stand up and unequivocally declare, "This is what happened." Believe me, her fight was a defiant, costly stand against the very principle of forced silence, a refusal to be bought or dismissed. For Gwyneth Paltrow, the emotional release is quieter, more internal, but no less profound. Her story is not a headline-screaming court case. It is a sensitive, historical detail whispered through the pages of a biography. But its echo in the present is devastatingly important. It serves as an undeniable validation for what so many women experience in relationships with powerful men, that emotional abuse is real and insidious, that it is often unseen, undocumented, and dismissed, and that it doesn't always leave the unambiguous evidence of bruises or broken bones. But it absolutely leaves deep, lasting psychological harm. Her courage, decades later, in allowing this truth to surface, highlighted the chilling consistency that even someone as seemingly untouchable and powerful as Gwyneth Paltrow once wept behind closed doors because of the alleged emotional cruelty of Brad Pitt. The two stories, placed side by side, force a pivot in the global conversation. The new question the world now faces is no longer a superficial assessment of his talent or star power, not whether Brad Pitt is a good actor or a global icon, but a far deeper, more uncomfortable moral inquiry whether Brad Pitt, like so many powerful men before him, has long been shielded from the true consequences of his actions by a complicit public and a protective industry. Have we collectively mistaken Brad Pitt's undeniable, dazzling charisma for genuine, sturdy character? Have we, in our fierce, almost desperate eagerness to keep the comforting fantasy of Brad Pitt alive, actively and systemically silenced victims? This sudden, painful clarity is not a simple call for cancellation, a term too shallow for the gravity of the allegations. It is a profound call for accountability, for truth, and for creating a safe space for survivors to speak their reality without the immediate, paralyzing fear of being instantly torn down, dismissed, and vilified. Angelina Jolie and Gwyneth Paltrow deserve to be heard, not because they are two of the most famous women on earth, but because their experience, regardless of their status, is fundamentally human. The terrifying realization remains: if two of the most powerful, Globally recognized women in Hollywood struggled so fiercely to be believed. What hope do the millions of women without a spotlight, without wealth, without a global platform, have when facing their own alleged abusers? Angelina Jolie once articulated her highest desire for her family. She wanted them to heal. But the path to healing begins with honesty, with the courage to truly listen, and with the profound, necessary act of facing the discomfort of seeing our idols as deeply, fundamentally flawed. It requires recognizing that sometimes the most glamorous, carefully constructed stories hide the darkest, most destructive truths. The illusion of Brad Pitt has cracked, not simply chipped, but suffered a fracture so deep and wide that it threatens the entire structure of the myth. And through that widening, painful crack, the light of a complex, validated truth is finally pouring in. And within that fractured light, the focus shifts, however briefly, to the innocent. Silent victims caught in the blast radius, particularly Knox Leon Jolie Pitt, a child born into a blinding fairy tale that contained a hidden poison. His quiet wound is that of growing up with a distant, volatile father, a life of staggering privilege shadowed by instability. Knox Leon Jolie Pitt, the son of the world's most dazzling couple, entered existence not just with parental love, but with the overwhelming, chaotic noise of cameras flashing and headlines screaming his rival. His birth was not a private miracle, but a global event, a commodity sold for millions, instantly cementing his status as a princeling in the celebrity monarchy. But what happens when the king is allegedly a fractured, controlling figure, and the kingdom is revealed to be a fragile void of peace? Knox, along with his siblings, spent his earliest, most formative years believing in the narrative of the perfect family, only to have that reality violently shattered on the floor of a private jet. His quiet wound is the internal, lifelong struggle of reconciling the mythical father the world adored with the terrifying, volatile figure he allegedly witnessed firsthand. He is a child born into light, forced to live in the shadow of a secret his own mother risked everything to expose, carrying the quiet, unseen burden of a conflict that began not in a courtroom, but in the private, suffocating atmosphere of his own home. The children are the ultimate proof that the alleged abuse was never a private drama. It was a devastating, systemic failure of protection. The quiet wound of Knox Leon Jolie Pitt is the most agonizing and often overlooked element in the catastrophic implosion of the global celebrity myth that was Brangelina. His birth was not merely a family event. It was an international phenomenon, a commercial and cultural explosion that cemented his destiny as a child of impossible fame. The world saw a picture-perfect infant, a miniature composite of cinematic royalty, seemingly destined for the same blinding spotlight that perpetually trailed his parents. But behind that dazzling glare in the private, often suffocating corners of a violently fractured family, Knox has lived a distinctly different, heartbreaking story. His narrative is shaped less by glamour and privilege and more by the cold, heavy weight of silence, distance, and the slow, agonizing ache of a father who, piece by agonizing piece, slowly disappeared from the frame. Brad Pitt, once universally hailed as Hollywood's quintessential golden father, the rugged, devoted patriarch of a diverse, global brood, has for years been an unmistakable absence